January the 17th, 1940, the frozen fields of northern France. A young Wehrmacht infantryman crouches in a hastily dug trench near the Belgian border, his breath forming clouds in the bitter winter air. The soil beneath his boots is hard as iron, unyielding to the entrenching tool that hangs from his belt. In his coat pocket, folded with care, rests a letter from home, his mother's handwriting, speaking of shortages, of ration cards, of quiet pride in her son serving the fatherland. He peers across the barren landscape toward the west, where somewhere beyond the skeletal trees and dormant farmland, the British Expeditionary Force waits. In his mind, shaped by years of careful propaganda and the lingering myths of the previous war, he carries an image of what awaits him. Soldiers soft from empire, gentlemen warriors more suited to parade grounds than killing fields, an army sustained by colonial exploitation but lacking the iron will of the new Germany. He believes, as he has been taught to believe, that when the moment comes, the British will break as they had broken before, that their democratic weakness will crumble against National Socialist steel. The wind carries the smell of snow and distant wood smoke. He does not know that everything he believes is about to be tested against a far harsher truth. The German military entered the Second World War carrying the psychological baggage of two contradictory memories. On one hand, the propaganda machine had spent years depicting Britain as a decaying imperial power, its martial spirit sapped by democratic softness, its soldiers the pampered products of a society grown complacent in the long shadow of Victorian glory. Newsreels showed British poverty, unemployment, the paralysis of parliamentary debate. School textbooks taught German youth that the British Empire was a hollow structure maintained through exploitation rather than genuine strength, destined to collapse when confronted by the vigor of the new order. Yet beneath this carefully constructed narrative lived another memory, one that could not be completely erased despite the efforts of Goebbels and his ministry. The memory of the Somme, of Passchendaele, of 4 years in which the British soldier, that supposedly soft product of democratic decay, had proven himself capable of enduring horrors that broke armies and toppled dynasties. The older officers, the men who had actually faced the British in the trenches of the Great War, carried scars both visible and invisible, and they knew what their younger comrades did not yet understand. They knew that the British soldier, when cornered, when fighting with his back to the Channel, possessed a stubbornness that bordered on the pathological. When the Wehrmacht finally crashed westward in May of 1940, launching the Great Offensive that would shatter France in 6 weeks, German soldiers encountered the reality of British resistance for the first time. The Blitzkrieg swept forward with mechanical precision, the careful orchestration of tanks, aircraft, and infantry that had been refined in Poland. Town after town fell. The French military, psychologically unprepared for the speed and violence of modern mechanized warfare, fractured along unexpected lines. But the British fought differently. At the canals of Belgium, at small villages whose names would never appear in grand histories, German assault troops encountered a style of defense that defied their expectations. British positions that should have collapsed after the first overwhelming blow instead held for hours, sometimes days. Machine gun nests remained operational long after their positions had been bypassed, their crews fighting until ammunition ran out or death claimed them. Lieutenant Hans von Luck, commanding reconnaissance units in the 7th Panzer Division, would later write in his memoirs of the confusion this generated among German troops. They had been told to expect collapse, rout, the psychological disintegration that came when soft soldiers faced hard men. Instead, they found adversaries who seemed constitutionally incapable of recognizing when they were beaten. At Arras on May 21st, the Wehrmacht experienced something it had not known since the invasion began: genuine tactical surprise and momentary fear. British Matilda tanks, heavily armoured and nearly impervious to standard German anti-tank guns, punched into the flanks of Rommel's division with shocking violence. For several hours, the entire southern flank of the German advance hung in the balance. Rommel himself was forced to organise anti-aircraft guns in a ground role, using their higher velocity shells to penetrate the British armour. The counterattack ultimately failed. Too few tanks, insufficient support, poor coordination with French units, but it left a psychological mark. In the flush of overwhelming victory, the Wehrmacht had been reminded that the British could still bite. German after-action reports from Arras speak with newfound respect, noting the aggressive determination of British tank crews who continued fighting even after their vehicles had been immobilized. One German officer observed that British tankers often had to be killed in their vehicles because they refused to surrender, even when further resistance was clearly futile. But it was at Dunkirk, in those desperate days between May 26 and June 4th, that German perceptions truly began to shift. The perimeter defence around the port became a crucible in which the Wehrmacht's assumptions about British fighting spirit were tested and found wanting. As the BEF contracted toward the beaches, German infantry and armour pressed against a shrinking defensive line held by British and French rearguards. The expectation, repeated in German briefings and planning sessions, was that the pocket would collapse rapidly once serious pressure was applied. Surrounded troops cut off from supply and retreat were supposed to surrender. This was military logic, the rational calculus of industrial warfare. But the British rearguards did not behave rationally. At Wormhout, at Kassel, at the canal lines south of Dunkirk, British battalions fought delaying actions that cost the Germans far more time and casualties than their operational planning had accounted for. The 2nd Battalion Royal Norfolk Regiment held their position at Le Paradis until they had fired every round, their defence so fierce that frustrated SS troops executed the survivors in a war crime that would haunt German military reputation for decades. German soldiers writing home during and after Dunkirk, their letters later captured or preserved in archives, speak with a tone markedly different from the confidence of April. They describe British soldiers who fought from ruined buildings until the structures collapsed, who maintained fire discipline even under artillery bombardment, who withdrew only when their positions became literally untenable. A corporal in the 18th Army wrote to his wife, "They do not fight like Frenchmen who are brave enough but seem to lose heart when the situation turns bad. The British keep shooting even when they must know they cannot win. It is as if they do not understand when they are beaten." Another soldier recovering from wounds in a field hospital told a medic, "I thought they would be like the Poles, brave but disorganized. Instead, they are like fighting a different German army, one that refuses to acknowledge reality. The Luftwaffe pilots attacking the Dunkirk beaches and the naval vessels offshore developed their own grudging respect, born from unexpected losses and fierce opposition. RAF fighters flying from bases in southern England contested the airspace over the evacuation with a tenacity that shocked German aviators accustomed to air superiority. The Spitfires and Hurricanes, though often outnumbered, dove into German bomber formations with what Luftwaffe crews described as reckless courage bordering on suicide. One Me-109 pilot, shot down and captured during the evacuation, told his interrogators that he had been taught British pilots were gentlemen flyers who avoided unnecessary risk. He had discovered instead men who seemed to view aerial combat as a personal duel, who pressed attacks to point-blank range rather than breaking off at safe distances. More than 100 German aircraft fell during the Dunkirk operation, a loss rate far higher than expected for operations against a defeated enemy. 338,000 soldiers escaped from Dunkirk. The Wehrmacht had lost the operational victory, the destruction of the BEF, and gained instead a strategic problem that would haunt Germany for the rest of the war. Those evacuated troops carried with them the memory of having defied the supposedly invincible Wehrmacht, of having held long enough to escape. And the German soldiers who had faced them carried different memories, ones that contradicted everything they had been told about British weakness. When the battle shifted to Britain itself in the summer and fall of 1940, German perceptions underwent further revision. The Luftwaffe, confident after victories in Poland, Norway and France, expected to break RAF fighter command through sustained pressure. Air superiority was supposed to be achievable within weeks, after which invasion could proceed. Instead, the Luftwaffe found itself locked in a grinding campaign of attrition against an opponent who refused to acknowledge the mathematics of destruction. British pilots, many of them barely out of training, flew sortie after sortie even as their numbers dwindled and exhaustion became a constant companion. They developed tactics on the fly, learning in combat what peacetime exercises could never teach. German bomber crews, accustomed to flying with fighter escort and minimal opposition, began suffering losses that made deep penetration missions increasingly costly. By September, the Luftwaffe was losing aircraft and experienced crew at rates that could not be sustained. German intelligence reports from this period, archived in Freiburg military records, show mounting frustration with British resilience. Analysts struggled to explain why fighter command had not collapsed despite the destruction of numerous aircraft and the evident exhaustion of its pilot. One report noted with barely concealed puzzlement, "The British appear to operate under a different calculus of acceptable losses. Their continued resistance defies standard operational analysis." Captured Luftwaffe officers, interviewed by British intelligence, often expressed variations of the same bewilderment. They had done everything correctly according to German military doctrine: concentrated force, sustained pressure, destruction of enemy assets. Yet the expected result had not materialized. The British had simply continued fighting. When German troops encountered British forces in North Africa, starting in early 1941, the lessons of France had largely been forgotten or dismissed as anomalies produced by the confusion of retreat. The Afrika Korps arrived in Libya confident, professional, prepared to restore German fortunes after Italian defeats. Instead, they found themselves locked in a grinding 2-year campaign against an opponent who proved maddeningly difficult to decisively defeat. British and Commonwealth forces withdrew when necessary, but rarely broke, regrouped quickly, and counterattacked with an aggressiveness that seemed to ignore unfavorable odds. At Tobruk, the besieged garrison held for 8 months, tying down Axis forces and serving as a constant thorn in Rommel's supply lines. German troops besieging the fortress developed a bitter respect for its defenders, particularly the Australian troops whose night raids and aggressive patrolling made the siege lines perpetually dangerous. Rommel himself, in private correspondence, admitted that the British soldier in North Africa was a formidable opponent when well led, possessing determination and coolness under fire that matches our own. The recurring symbol that threaded through German observations of British forces was the cigarette. In letters home, in diaries later captured or published, German soldiers repeatedly noted the British habit of smoking under fire, of lighting cigarettes during lulls in combat, of maintaining this small ritual of normalcy even in the most extreme circumstances. To German troops raised in a culture that emphasized iron discipline and stoic endurance, this British habit seemed initially to confirm prejudices about casual, undisciplined soldiers, but observation over time produced a different interpretation. The cigarette became a symbol of something more troubling, an almost casual courage, a refusal to grant the circumstances the power to disrupt ordinary routines. A German NCO captured in Tunisia told his interrogators, "They smoke like they are at a cafe even when shells are falling. It is not bravery like ours, which requires will and discipline. Theirs is different, as if danger is simply another inconvenience to be tolerated. This observation captured something essential about how Germans came to view British military psychology, not as weakness, but as an alien form of strength rooted in different cultural soil. By 1944, when the Wehrmacht faced British forces in Normandy and the subsequent campaign through northwestern Europe, any remaining illusions had been thoroughly stripped away. The soldiers who fought at Caen, at Villers-Bocage, in the grinding battles for the Norman hedgerows were defending against an enemy they had learned to respect, even as they hated the strategic situation that made defeat inevitable. British infantry tactics had evolved considerably since 1940, incorporating hard lessons about combined arms coordination, artillery concentration, and the integration of armour. But the fundamental characteristic remained stubborn, methodical persistence. British attacks often lacked the flair and improvisation that characterized American operations, but they possessed a grinding inevitability that German defenders found exhausting. When a British division set itself to taking an objective, it kept coming regardless of casualties, regardless of setbacks, applying pressure until something broke. German veterans interviewed after the war in the extensive historical debriefings conducted by Allied military historians, consistently described British forces in terms that blended respect, frustration, and a kind of weary acknowledgement. They spoke of opponents who were correct in their tactics, methodical, difficult to surprise, but also difficult to panic. The characterization was not affectionate. These were, after all, enemies who had contributed to Germany's destruction, but it was honest. The soft, decadent soldiers of propaganda had never existed, or had existed only in the wishful thinking of men who needed to believe their enemies were weaker than themselves. The reality had proven far more complex and far more dangerous. The evening of May 8, 1945, Flensburg, northern Germany. A Wehrmacht major sits in the ruins of what was once a hotel, now serving as a temporary detention facility for senior officers awaiting formal processing. Outside, the sounds of celebration drift across the water from British positions. Victory in Europe has been declared. The war is officially ended. He holds no weapon now, no rank that carries meaning, only memories and the bitter knowledge of comprehensive defeat. On the floor beside him lies a British newspaper left by a guard or perhaps blown in through the shattered window. He cannot read English well, but the photographs need no translation. Crowds in London, in Birmingham, in Manchester, celebrating deliverance from a threat that came so close to victory. He thinks of his brother, killed at Caen, of his commander, dead in the Falaise pocket, of all the men who had marched westward 5 years earlier, believing in inevitable victory, in the superiority of their system, in the weakness of democratic soldiers. How many of those men still lived? How many had learned, as he had learned through years of brutal instruction, that courage and determination could not be monopolized by a single ideology or system? The British had not won because they were supermen or because they possessed some secret weapon. They had won because they refused to lose, because their version of stubbornness proved more durable than German will to conquest. In the failing light, he understands what propaganda had never taught, that free men defending their homes fight differently than conquerors seeking glory, and that difference, in the end, had mattered more than tactics or technology or temporary advantage. The cigarette smoke still drifts through his memory, that symbol of British composure under fire, and he knows now what it truly meant. Not weakness or casual indiscipline, but a quiet certainty that they would endure whatever came, that they would still be standing when the smoke cleared. And they were. And Germany was not.